Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a close look at the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague. It's set for June 25th, and honestly, the alliance is facing some really critical challenges.
That's absolutely right. You know, the main task for the 32 allies seems pretty clear on the surface, but it's incredibly delicate. They've got to somehow smooth over growing disagreements with Washington.
Especially about Russia and Ukraine, right?
Exactly. And do that while trying not to cause a major transatlantic blowup.
And this isn't your typical drawn-out summit either. It's what, just one session?
Yeah, a single 2.5-hour meeting. Very condensed.
Which is apparently designed to suit U.S. President Trump's preference for shorter meetings. It really signals the kind of, well, tightrope they're walking.
It really does. And a key thing everyone expects to come out of this short meeting is a big promise on spending.
The 5% of GDP figure.
That's the one. At least 5% on defense and defense infrastructure. It's a core demand coming straight from the White House. It really underpins the whole thing.
So the big questions we're trying to unpack today are pretty stark, aren't they? Like, is this promise enough to actually hold NATO together?
And what happens if U.S. military backing for Europe and that solid stance against Russia just isn't a given anymore?
Yeah, we could be looking at a fundamental shift in how things work globally.
So we'll dig into what different experts are saying about the alliance's future. We'll look at the deep divisions, the changing strategies, and Europe's ongoing reliance on the U.S. military.
Okay, let's start with NATO's resilience. People often say the alliance is surprisingly good at handling major disagreements. Is that fair?
Historically, yes. There's a track record. I mean, think back. There were serious worries that U.S. President Trump's, let's say, tough stance on allies could lead to a disaster at previous summits.
Right. Threats about pulling out if spending targets weren't met, seeming less keen to condemn Russia.
Exactly. And talk about annexing Canada or Greenland, humiliating Ukraine's president, holding back intel. All those things caused real anxiety. There was this initial fear he might just announce a full U.S. troop withdrawal from Europe.
Which would basically invite Russia to push further west.
Potentially, yes. But NATO has this knack for, well, holding opposing ideas at the same time. Like the Harmel report back in '67, Deterrence and Détente, or the '79 dual-track decision, deploying new missiles while talking arms control.
Finding ways to square the circle, essentially.
Pretty much. But today's challenge feels maybe a bit different. You have Washington openly talking about ditching treaty commitments.
While Europe is terrified it can't defend itself without America. That feels new.
It does. And the expected compromise at The Hague reflects that. U.S. President Trump probably will announce some troop reduction. But the headline news will be all 32 allies agreeing to that 5% GDP spending level.
And how does that break down again?
Well, the plan is 3.5% going directly to troops and weapons, and the other 1.5% for things like infrastructure.
Just to give that some scale, for the U.S. to hit 3.5% itself, it'd need to add, what, another $380 billion to its defense budget annually?
That's the number. It's massive. It shows the scale of what's being asked of Europe.
So allies are basically walking a tightrope, trying to satisfy U.S. President Trump.
While kind of downplaying the risk of fewer U.S. troops. It really shows how alliances adapt. Even under, direct threats, they keep functioning.
Okay, let's shift to Russia. There's been a huge change in how the alliance talks about Russia, hasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. If you look back at the 2024 Washington Summit communique, it was tough. Condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine, called Russia the most significant and direct threat. They were even going to draft a whole new Russia strategy for this 2025 summit.
But that stopped dead after U.S. President Trump's election, right? Because everyone realized Washington and Europe just wouldn't agree on Russia.
That's the understanding, yes. U.S. President Trump seems determined to reset relations with Russian President Putin, wants a more constructive path, even with the aggression continuing.
And his view of the world, great powers having spheres of influence, smaller countries, less sovereign.
It aligns pretty closely with Russian President Putin's thinking, yes.
And meanwhile, talks to actually end the war in Ukraine are completely stalled. Russian President Putin isn't stopping anytime soon.
Right. So given all that, this NATO summit is really focused on avoiding big transatlantic fights, which means Russia and Ukraine. They're likely sidelined on the main agenda. President Zelensky won't be at the main session.
But what if this U.S. reset with Russian President Putin actually happens? If the U.S. stops isolating Russia while the war's still raging, that sounds like a massive problem for NATO unity.
It would be a profound split. Because you have to remember, most European NATO members, maybe apart from Hungary and Slovakia, are still united. They condemn Russia, they support Ukraine, they see Russian President Putin as determined to rewrite the post-Cold War map and a major threat.
So if the U.S. President Trump administration pulls support for Ukraine and fully engages with Russia again,
it would be the first time in NATO's history that U.S. and European views on the Russian threat were so dramatically different.
So the job for European members, plus Canada and Turkey, becomes
figuring out how to deter Russia, possibly without full U.S. agreement. They've shown commitment to spend more, take more responsibility for Ukraine, but keeping that up if the U.S. isn't penalizing Russia, that's the challenge for the next few years.
Let's pivot to Europe's own military muscle, or maybe the lack of it, and this long-term dependence on the U.S.
Yeah, this isn't new. Europe relying on U.S. military capabilities, it's like baked into the system. It's fundamental to how transatlantic security has worked since NATO started. The U.S. has always been the main integrator, the strategic linchpin.
So it's not just about Europe needing more soldiers or tanks. The problem runs deeper.
Much deeper. Europe lacks what are called strategic enablers. These are the critical things you need to actually integrate and sustain complex combat operations over time.
And these are mostly provided by?
Almost entirely by the United States. We're talking about things like high-level intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance ISR, satellites, advanced radar. Also, precision strike capabilities for high-value targets, long-range air defense systems, robust command and control networks.
The essential plumbing of modern warfare.
Exactly. Plus, frankly, many European military leaders just don't have deep experience commanding really large ground formations. That's another gap.
And there are other specific shortfalls too, right? Like air power.
Yes. European air forces often struggle with complex missions suppressing sophisticated enemy air defenses, hitting hardened targets deep inside enemy territory. And naval forces have limitations in anti-submarine warfare, which is pretty critical when facing Russia.
So these aren't minor issues. They really highlight the dependency and the urgent gaps Europe needs to fill.
And you see it in practical terms. Remember those discussions about maybe sending European troops for a hypothetical Ukraine ceasefire?
Politically, yes.
Well, it became clear the countries involved couldn't even pull together 2 or 3 mechanized brigades, maybe 10,000 troops total, working jointly. Despite having large armies on paper, it showed those systemic limits.
And that directly impacts NATO's plans for defending places like the Baltics, where Germany is supposed to send strong forces.
Absolutely. It undermines the credibility of those defense plans. If Europe can't realistically plan and sustain a major military operation on its own, NATO's deterrence is weakened, especially if a U.S. withdrawal becomes a real possibility.
So the next few years sound potentially quite dangerous, vulnerable.
It could be a period of real vulnerability, yes. European allies urgently need to invest in those critical enabling capabilities that the U.S. has historically provided to make sure they have truly deployable, combat-ready forces.
Let's think about Europe's old security model. It seems everyone now agrees it's broken.
Yeah, the sort of post-Cold War dream, built on cheap Russian energy, cheap Chinese goods, and cheap American security. We now see that was never sustainable, especially not now.
And you have U.S. President Trump wanting to lessen Washington's role, just as intelligence agencies are warning Russia might actually be gearing up to potentially attack a NATO country by, the end of the decade?
That's the time frame some agencies are suggesting, yes. And it's not just talk. Russia is actively modernizing bases near NATO borders. Its defense spending last year was higher than all European countries combined.
So Europe's past reluctance to properly rearm, it's moved beyond embarrassing to actually dangerous in emergency?
I think that's a fair assessment. It's now an emergency.
Which brings us back to the summit agreement. Allies likely agreeing to that 3.5% of GDP on defense plus 1.5% on infrastructure, giving U.S. President Trump his 5% total.
Right. And look, that increased spending could help fix some gaps. Europe definitely needs to boost its defense industry. It's too fragmented, underfunded, and they need new tech drones, AI, space assets, things that have been crucial in Ukraine.
But the big question mark is follow-through, isn't it? Promises are easy.
That's the critical point. Remember the old 2% target. A decade after agreeing to it, only 23 out of 32 allies were actually meeting it.
So without clear, detailed plans, timelines, specific capabilities, they'll buy this new 5% promise could just be words.
It risks being meaningless, yes. Ultimately, force or credible capability is what leaders like Russian President Putin respect. Europe needs to be strong enough today to deter him so they don't have to fight him tomorrow, especially if they might have to do it alone.
Let's zoom in on Germany. Its role seems absolutely pivotal here.
It really is. And, European leaders are heading to The Hague feeling maybe cautiously optimistic this time, unlike that tense Brussels summit in 2018.
Because now they have this plan for the 5% target, even if part of it is infrastructure.
Exactly. They have an answer for U.S. President Trump. And there's a broader recognition in Europe now they need a new burden-sharing deal. Europeans have to pick up more of the conventional defense tab.
And Germany, with its economic clout, is key. The new chancellor, Merz, seems to be making some positive moves, improving ties with neighbors, talking constructively with U.S. President Trump.
Yes, optimizing decision-making in Berlin, better relations with Paris, Warsaw, London, and crucially, preparing the ground for constitutional changes to allow much higher defense spending. That's significant.
But good intentions aside, can that really counter U.S. President Trump's sheer unpredictability? That fear of a sudden U.S. withdrawal, like maybe he considered in 2018, it hasn't gone away.
No, it hasn't. And even if U.S. officials try to reassure everyone that any troop cuts won't create a deterrence gap, the reality is a disagreement over, say, trade or tariffs or Ukraine could just trigger an unexpected decision from U.S. President Trump.
And there's an internal threat, too, isn't there? People might accept more defense spending in principle, but hitting 5% means painful cuts elsewhere. Social programs, maybe?
For most European countries, yes. It will involve tough trade-offs. And that creates an opening, potentially, for pro-Russian populists. Well, they could argue, why spend all this money on defense, making painful cuts, if the U.S. might abandon us anyway? Maybe we should just make a deal with Moscow instead. It raises that ugly possibility of appeasement.
And if the worst happens, if the U.S. does walk away from its commitments, Germany seems uniquely vulnerable, more than frontline states or nuclear powers like the UK and France.
Yes, because Germany's whole post-war identity is so deeply tied to being part of a U.S.-led West within NATO. If that framework disappears, what is Germany's role? It's a profound question.
And you have right-wing populists like the AfD party pushing for a rearmed Germany, but one maybe closer to Russia.
Exactly, which is ironically probably not an outcome U.S. President Trump himself actually wants, but it shows the risks.
It feels like the underlying message for leaders at the summit needs to be crystal clear. Russia is preparing for a potential conflict with NATO.
That's what the intelligence picture suggests. Moscow isn't just replacing losses from Ukraine, it's actively boosting its military potential. New weapons, more troops, modernizing bases near NATO's eastern flank. They might wait until the Ukraine war winds down, but maybe not.
So Europe has to be ready for war to prevent war?
Precisely. But NATO's traditional deterrence is being weakened by two big things right now.
Okay, what are they?
First, NATO's own military strength, especially in Europe, just hasn't kept pace with the growing threat. Russia's economy is weird for war. Its people seem willing to pay the price. European militaries, industries, societies, they're only just starting to adjust.
And the second thing?
NATO's unity is fraying. U.S. President Trump's rhetoric attacking allies, questioning security guarantees. It creates doubt. And some Western European countries have shown, frankly, fear and hesitation about confronting Russia over Ukraine. That shifts the power balance towards Moscow.
So what's Russia's potential path to victory in their thinking? An attack aimed at breaking the alliance?
That seems likely. Maybe a ground operation against a smaller NATO member. They'd count on their large manpower pool versus Western societies being less tolerant of heavy casualties.
And combine that with?
Combine heavy frontline losses for NATO troops with massive missile strikes on rear areas hitting critical infrastructure and constant nuclear threats from the Kremlin. The bet might be that Western politicians and publics would just sue for peace quickly, on Moscow's terms.
It's a chilling scenario. So what does NATO need to do? What are the absolute must-dos?
Three things seem paramount. One, keep supporting Ukraine. As long as Russia's tied down there, a direct attack on NATO seems less probable.
Makes sense, too.
Build a truly robust defense posture. NATO currently lacks the ability to guarantee stopping Russia at the border. That means European defense industries need a massive reorientation towards military needs. Now,
And the third priority?
invest incredible ways to hit back. Make it crystal clear that any conventional missile attack on critical European infrastructure will bring severe consequences, and be unambiguous that nuclear threats, let alone use, won't be tolerated, and back that up with real capabilities.
But there are doubts about the U.S. nuclear umbrella now.
Which means European nuclear powers like France and the UK need to step up and strengthen their own deterrence capabilities.
How are the frontline states, those closest to Russia, reacting to all this?
They're preparing for the worst-case scenario. having to defend themselves without guaranteed U.S. help. Countries in Northern Europe, the Baltics, Poland, they're not waiting. They've been active since the Ukraine conflict started.
We're seeing unprecedented cooperation, like among the Nordic countries.
Absolutely. Military cooperation is at levels never seen before. Poland's aiming for a huge military force, 500,000 active and reserve personnel. Northern European air forces are training and operating together constantly.
And in the Baltic Sea, Estonia and Finland working together on hybrid threats.
Yes. Expanded naval cooperation. They're actively detaining Russian and Chinese ships suspected of things like sabotaging underwater cables or jamming GPS, which have become real problems.
And this regional effort fits with NATO's own plans for new forward forces.
It complements it.
Yeah.
NATO's setting up a forward ground HQ in northern Finland. Germany's deploying an armored brigade to Lithuania. It's happening alongside this regional push.
These frontline states are also giving huge support to Ukraine, right? Relative to their size.
Immense support. 4 Nordic states, the 3 Baltics, and Poland, they make up 8 of the top 9 donors to Ukraine as a percentage of their GDP. They're jointly buying ammo for Kyiv. Denmark's helping fund weapons production inside Ukraine.
And they're ramping up their own ammo production, too.
Yes. Finland's becoming a major European ammo producer. The Czech Republic is working towards having a complete artillery shell supply chain domestically.
So the countries most at risk are putting their money where their mouth is on defense spending. That 5% target is real for them?
It is. Poland's aiming for around 5% this year. The Baltics are committed to that level by 2026. Denmark's doubled its defense budget since 2022. Sweden's loosened budget rules to find billions more for defense.
So while they obviously hope the alliance holds together,
they're preparing for every possibility, with or without the United States.
It's sobering to think that while attacking NATO used to seem like suicide for Russia, Moscow might now calculate that Europe just doesn't have the staying power, the air defense, the tanks, the artillery for a long, hard war.
And building that strength will take Europe years and huge sums of money. Combine that with the uncertainty over U.S. help. Well, it creates arguably the most dangerous situation in Europe for decades.
And maybe Russia doesn't even need a full-scale war. This idea of win first, then seek battle.
Right. Moscow might be trying to normalize the idea that covert attacks in Europe are just background noise. The Skripal poisoning, those underwater cable breaks, jamming civilian airliners, making it seem routine.
Can you give a concrete example of how they might test NATO without tanks rolling, maybe involving Kaliningrad?
Okay, here's a hypothetical scenario. A train traveling for the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad to Moscow breaks down inside Lithuania, a country Russia considers unfriendly.
Okay.
Russian police arrive from Kaliningrad, supposedly to help. Then maybe some military personnel join them. Suddenly, a piece of Lithuanian territory is effectively outside state control.
Lithuania could invoke Article 5, NATO's Mutual Defense Clause, but what happens then? In the middle of this ambiguous fake rescue.
Exactly. How would the Allies react? Especially if the U.S. president seems more inclined to listen to the Russian leader. What could Europe realistically do, given it needs maybe 5-10 more years to be truly independent militarily?
Would the alliance hold or just collapse under the pressure and uncertainty?
That's the terrifying question. And history teaches us adversaries don't attack when you expect it. They attack when you're vulnerable, unprepared. That's why European nations need to move fast now, not gradually. Anything less feels irresponsible, frankly. It risks war.
All this turbulence might also push Europe to look east, towards Asia, in new ways.
It's a real possibility. In an era where U.S. President Trump seems to devalue traditional alliances, both European and Asian allies of the U.S. have a clear incentive to work more closely together.
Even if some in Washington want to focus U.S. power on Asia and pull back from Europe.
Well, U.S. President Trump's skepticism about alliances generally, and his focus on trade deals, affects Asian allies too. And arguably, they face an even bigger military imbalance with China than Europe does with Russia.
Plus, U.S. President Trump has often talked about wanting big deals with both Russian President Putin and China. Bringing Russia back to the G7, maybe letting China join too.
Right. So whether he actually makes a strategic break or just agrees to let Russia and China dominate their regions, the sheer uncertainty coming from Washington is enough to push Eurasian allies towards greater security cooperation amongst themselves.
There were already moves in this direction, weren't there? Connecting European and Asian security.
Yes. The Biden administration continued work, started by Japan's late Prime Minister Abe, trying to get European countries more involved in the Indo-Pacific, seeing security in Europe and Asia as linked.
Which is why we saw countries like Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, the AP4 at recent NATO summits.
Exactly. And hopefully they'll be at The Hague too. India is also building deeper security ties with Europe, particularly France and the EU. Concerns about U.S. unpredictability and the growing Russia-China axis are driving that.
So this could almost be seen as a return to a more natural state. Europe and Asia interacting dynamically, shaping the Eurasian order like they did for centuries before the U.S. became dominant.
That's one way to frame it, yes. After the World Wars, the U.S. became the main security provider in both regions. But now, instead of panicking about a potential U.S. withdrawal, maybe Europe and Asia can unite to strengthen the balance of power across Eurasia themselves.
And perhaps some of those conversations could start, even informally, at The Hague.
It's certainly a possibility, and perhaps a necessity.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.